Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a question that, well, it really feels like the absolute starting point for any kind of systematic philosophy. Where do you even begin? With what concept must transcendental philosophy actually start?
Yeah, and this isn't just, about picking the first topic in a textbook. For thinkers like Immanuel Kant and G.W.F. Hegel, this was absolutely critical. Building a whole system of knowledge, whether it's about how we understand the world or about pure thought itself, really hinges on identifying that one single foundational concept.
The one that everything else rests on.
Exactly. It has to be unmediated, the most fundamental thing you can think of. And if you get that starting concept wrong, well, the whole structure potentially comes crashing down.
And what's really fascinating, looking at the sources, is how both Kant and Hegel, coming from pretty different philosophical places, ended up wrestling with essentially the same core idea, right at the highest level of thought. We're talking about nothingness and this concept of absolute indeterminacy.
So our mission today is really to dig into their different approaches here. We'll look at Kant, who insists quite meticulously on needing a sort of mediating concept, this highest concept, to even get his critique off the ground.
And the problems that created for him internally.
Right, the internal tension it sets up. And then we'll pivot and see how Hegel basically grabs onto that very tension, embraces that absolute indeterminacy, and uses it as a kind of dynamic engine to kickstart his own massive system, the logic.
Okay, so to really get the stakes here, we need to start where Kant himself kind of flags this issue. It's almost like a side note right at the end of the Transcendental Analytic in the first critique.
That's right, A290, B346 for those tracking. He's just finished laying out the core concepts of our understanding the categories, and he stops. He feels like he needs to add this reflection, he says, for the completeness of the system.
And what does he say? He points out the usual starting point for metaphysics.
Right. He observes that traditionally these systems tend to begin with a basic division. What's possible versus what's impossible. Seems logical enough.
But he immediately questions that. Why isn't that the real beginning for Kant?
Because, he argues, think about it. Any conceptual division, any split between, say, A and not A, it always presupposes some broader concept that's being divided. You need a higher, more general, which means less specific, less determinate concept first, before you can even make that split between possible something and impossible nothing.
Okay, so that's Kant throwing down the gauntlet. He's saying to his predecessors, hold on, you can't just leap into that distinction. You need to tell me what's the shared ground, the conceptual space, that makes distinguishing possible from impossible even meaningful.
Precisely. And for Kant, that absolutely necessary, higher, less determinate concept has to be the concept of an object in general. Gegenstand, Überhaupt. And crucially, he says, taken problematically.
What does problematically mean there?
It means we haven't decided yet whether this object in general falls into the category of something possible or nothing impossible. We're holding it in suspension as the neutral ground from which that distinction will emerge. So let's unpack that a bit more, the philosophical context Kant was pushing back against. In the 18th century, especially in German rationalism, the starting point was often really anchored in pure logic.
You mentioned Baumgarten earlier. Alexander Baumgarten's Metaphysics of Kant actually used this text in his lectures, didn't he?
He did, yeah. And Baumgarten provides a perfect example. He kicks off his whole system by defining this fundamental distinction between being and non-being, something and nothing.
How does he define them?
Well, for Baumgarten, in section 7, nothing, the nihil negativum, is simply the logically impossible. It's any concept that harbors a contradiction, like A and not A simultaneously. Pure logic violation.
Okay.
Then in section 8, something aliquid is whatever is representable, whatever doesn't contain a contradiction. So the whole foundation rests squarely on the principle of non-contradiction. Logical possibility is the baseline.
So the old way starts with logical consistency. Is the concept coherent or not? But Kant's saying, nope, that distinction itself isn't the very first thought.
Exactly right. His methodological move, his correction, really rests on two key premises. The first one we touched on, the concept division principle. You can almost picture it like an umbrella.
Okay.
The whole realm of concepts is under this big umbrella. If you then divide what's under the umbrella into two sections, let's say, A and not A, the umbrella itself, the overall category or genus, has to be a higher, more general concept, C. Both A and not A are just specific determinations under C.
I get the logic, like animal is the higher concept for dog and not dog. But why does the absolute beginning of philosophy absolutely have to follow this specific logical structure?
Right.
Couldn't we just start with a fundamental opposition, like, I don't know, light and dark, or being and unbeing directly?
That's a great question. It's because Kant is aiming for an absolutely necessary system, what he calls an architectonic. It has to be rigorously structured from the ground up. If you just start with two opposed concepts, like possible and impossible, you haven't actually justified why those two are the fundamental opposition, or what conceptual space they both occupy and divide.
Oh, okay.
Kant demands that the ultimate foundation must itself be the least determined, least specific concept possible.
I see. So starting with something less determinate ensures you're not accidentally smuggling in some unexamined assumption right at the beginning.
That's the ambition, absolutely. Which brings us to his second premise. Identifying the highest concept. In Transcendental philosophy, which for Kant is the science dealing with the pure concepts of our understanding, that ultimate, least determinate concept, our C, the umbrella, that makes the division between something possible and nothing impossible possible. That concept must be object in general.
So the whole system has to begin by thinking about what it even means to be an object of thought, period. Before we even get to whether it's real, imaginary, contradictory, consistent, just objectness.
Yes, but we have to be super careful about what this object in general, Gegenstand überhaupt, means for Kant. It's definitely not a physical thing out there in space and time. It's a very minimal, very formal notion. Think of it as just the bare whatness or the aboutness of any representation. It's what a thought or perception refers to. And importantly, it's always tied to a representing subject in Kant's system. His philosophy is critical, focused on the conditions of our knowledge.
Okay.
And here's the kicker. This concept of object in general is so general, it has to include even the logically impossible objects, like a square circle.
Wait, how can a square circle be an object?
Because even a contradictory concept, like square circle, is still the content of a representation. When you think square circle, your thought is about something, even if that something is logically impossible and could never exist or be experienced. It still functions as the object of that particular, albeit nonsensical thought.
Huh. It really sounds like Kant is forcing philosophy to reflect on its own most basic tools first. Instead of asking what's out there, he's asking what's the absolute minimum we need just to think about anything at all.
That's a very good way to put it. He's setting the stage by defining the ultimate container for all possible thought contents.
Okay, so once Kant puts forward this object of representation as the necessary highest concept, this most general container, what does he do with it? You mentioned he uses the possible-impossible distinction to build something quite remarkable.
He does. He uses it to generate this really quite brilliant piece of systematic thinking, the table of nothings.
A table of nothings. It sounds almost paradoxical. This isn't just some random list, though, is it? It sounds like it's meant to be a kind of structural map of the mind's limits.
That's exactly what it is. And crucially, Kant shifts the whole discussion of nothing away from just being a matter of pure logic, like Baumgarten's contradiction, to being a transcendental issue.
Meaning it relates to the conditions of our possible experience.
Precisely. For Kant, the difference between something, what's possible for us to know or experience, and nothing, what's impossible, isn't some metaphysical divide between types of beings floating around out there. It's a distinction based entirely on the relationship between the concept of an object and the specific formal conditions of our cognitive faculties, our understanding with its concepts, and our sensibility with its forms of intuition, namely space and time.
So possibility isn't just about the object itself, but about whether that object fits our mental machinery. Possibility is a modal category, right? It expresses the object's relationship to our whole cognitive setup, our Erkenntnis Vermögen.
Exactly. You've hit on a key Kantian point. Modality doesn't add anything to the concept of the thing itself. It just situates that concept relative to our capacity for knowledge. And this immediately splits the idea of possibility in two.
Yeah, so?
We get logical possibility, which is just the bare minimum does the concept contradict itself. This relates only to the understanding. But then we get real possibility, which is much stricter. For something to be really possible, its concept must not only be logically consistent, but must also agree with the formal conditions of all possible experience.
Which for Kant means it has to be compatible with both our concepts and our forms of intuition, space, and time.
Correct. Real possibility is about whether something could, in principle, be an object within our spatio-temporal experience structured by the categories. And since Kant's whole framework for possible experience is organized by the table of categories, those four main headings, quantity, quality, relation, modality, he can now systematically derive four distinct ways something can count as nothing for us.
Okay, I think I see where this is going. Each type of nothing corresponds to a way a concept fails to meet the conditions of real possibility tied to one of the category groups.
You got it. Let's walk through this table. It's actually quite elegant. First, under quantity.
What kind of nothing relates to quantity?
This is the quantitative nothing, which Kant calls ens rationis, literally a being of reason. This is defined as a concept to which no corresponding intuition can be given. It's a concept without a possible object we could ever encounter.
And the prime example here would be
the noumenon, the thing in itself, considered completely independently of how it might appear to us through our senses. We can think the concept of a noumenon. Kant says it's not logically contradictory.
So why is it a nothing in terms of quantity?
Because quantity deals with concepts like unity, plurality, totality, essentially, with number and countability. Since we can never have an intuition of a noumenon, we can never actually individuate them, count them, or gather them into a distinct manifold.
So if I try to ask, how many noumena is hiding behind my desk? Or is the noumenon on the chair the same as the noumenon at the table? Those questions are meaningless.
Precisely. The concept noumenon is quantitatively indeterminate for our cognition. We can't apply numbers or relations of identity and difference to them because we lack the necessary intuitive basis. So it's nothing for us in terms of quantity, even if it's something in itself. It's what happens when you try to apply quantity categories beyond the bounds of possible sensory experience.
Okay, that makes sense. What about quality?
Under quality, we find the qualitative nothing, or nihil privativum. This is the concept of a mere absence, a lack of some positive quality. Think of examples like cold, shadow, silence, darkness.
These seem like fairly straightforward concepts of negation. What's the specific nothingness Kant sees here?
Well, the subtlety isn't just saying absence is nothing. Kant's categories of quality deal with reality, affirmation, presence of a quality, and negation, absence. He argues that while we represent reality through sensation, the nihil privativum, the concept of a pure absence, is tricky. It's impossible to represent it constitutively on its own.
Why not?
Because our very representation of an absence always depends, implicitly or explicitly, on having some acquaintance with the corresponding presence. To really represent shadow, you need some concept or experience of light. To represent cold, you need warmth.
So someone born blind couldn't truly represent the absence of color, only maybe the concept of that absence linked to the word.
That's the idea. The representation of lack gets its content, paradoxically, from the presence it negates. If you try to think of an absolute qualitative nothing, the complete absence of any positive quality or sensation whatsoever, the representation kind of collapses. Without any positive sensory filling, the category of quality itself becomes empty. So it's a transcendental nothing in terms of quality.
Interesting. Okay, third group, relation.
Here we have the relational nothing, or ens imaginarium, an imaginary being. This category covers concepts that fail to be determined under the relational categories: substance, cause-effect, and community reciprocity. And Kant's prime examples here are fascinating: pure space and pure time.
But wait, pure space and time are fundamental for Kant. They're the a priori forms of our intuition. How can they be nothings? They seem like transcendental somethings.
They absolutely are transcendental somethings. They're the necessary conditions for any empirical experience. That's the paradox. However, when we try to treat space and time themselves as independent objects and apply the relational categories to them, they fail the test.
How do they fail?
Well, think about substance. Can we experience space itself as a substance, an enduring thing that exists on its own and has properties? Or time itself as a thing that causes effects? No. We experience objects in space and time which have substance and causal relations. But space and time, considered purely as the forms of intuition, lack the empirical stuff needed to be categorized as substances or causes in their own right.
So we can imagine pure space, but we can't conceptualize it under the category of substance.
Exactly. They are the mere form of intuition, lacking the matter required for determination under the relational categories. We can imagine them, hence an imaginarium, but they're relational nothings when it comes to conceptual determination as objects.
Wow, okay. That's quite subtle. Which leaves us with the last one, Modality.
And modality brings us right back around to the beginning in a way. Here we find the modal nothing, the nihil negativum. This is the classic logical contradiction, the object of a concept that flat out contradicts itself. His example, a two-sided rectilinear figure.
A two-sided polygon. Yeah, that's just impossible by definition.
Right. And Kant says this nihil negativum is, in a sense, the most fundamental or general type of nothing. Why? Because logical possibility, just avoiding self-contradiction, is the absolute baseline requirement. If a concept fails even this test,
then it can't even get in the game to be considered for real possibility under quantity, quality, or relation.
Precisely. It lacks the most basic condition needed to even potentially relate to our cognitive faculties in a meaningful way. It's not being defined by its own internal inconsistency.
That table of nothings is really quite something. It's, like you said, the photographic negative of his whole system. By systematically showing how concepts can fail to meet the conditions of possible experience, he's mapping out the precise boundaries of what our minds can legitimately know and experience. Defining the possible by carefully delineating the impossible.
Exactly. It's a boundary-setting operation. Defining the limits from the outside in. #tag 3, the philosophical tension in Kant's beginning.
Okay, we've seen the impressive structure Kant builds from his starting point, but now we need to circle back to that beginning itself, the object of representation in general, because you hinted earlier that there's a real philosophical difficulty lurking there.
Yes, this is where the internal tension really starts to bite attention that, as we'll see, Hegel absolutely pounces on.
And the core of the problem is what you call the indeterminacy problem.
Right. Remember Kant's two requirements for the starting concept? It has to be the highest concept, meaning maximally general and thus maximally indeterminate. But it also has to perform the function of mediating the distinction between something possible and nothing impossible. It needs to have just enough conceptual content to do that job.
Okay, highest means indeterminate, but it also needs some content to be useful. That already sounds like a conflict.
It is, especially when you look at Kant's own rules for how concepts work, particularly the logic he taught, often called the Gestal logic. According to that logic, the content or intention of a concept, basically, the set of defining marks or characteristics it includes, is made up of all the more general concepts contained within it.
Like the content of human includes the more general concepts, animal and rational.
Exactly. The higher, more general concepts form the intention of the lower, more specific concept. So what happens when you get to the absolute highest concept, the object of representation in general?
Well, by definition, there's no more general concept above it. It's the top of the pyramid.
Precisely. And if there's no higher genus, then according to the standard rules of concept formation, it seems like it should have zero intention. No conceptual content whatsoever. It should just be an empty placeholder.
But wait, how does Kant even argue we arrive at such general concepts? Doesn't he talk about abstraction?
He does. He uses the famous analogy of comparing different trees, say a spruce, a willow, and a linden. We look at them, we compare them, we abstract away the differences, needle shape, leaf shape, bark type, and we keep only what's common, arriving at the general concept tree.
Okay, that makes sense for going from specific trees to the general concept tree.
Right. It explains how we move from species up to genus. But that process of abstraction doesn't logically explain why the final maximally general concept, like representation in general or object in general, should retain any positive content if it's truly the highest concept, not a species under some yet higher genus. What definite characteristic is left when you abstract away literally everything specific, including maybe even the link to human cognition, space, and time?
If you abstract away everything, shouldn't you be left with, well, nothing?
That's the logical conclusion. Or at least you're left with a serious dilemma. Option 1. You insist that the concept object of representation must have some minimal determinate content. Maybe just the tiny mark of being related to a subject or being the content of a representation.
Okay, give it some minimal job description.
But if you do that, it immediately stops being the highest concept, because as soon as it has a determinate mark like related to a subject, that implies a contrast with its opposite, not related to a subject, like a thing in itself completely independent of thought, or maybe that which is not a representation. Suddenly, your supposedly highest concept is just one species under an even more general, unacknowledged division.
So giving it content violates the rule that it must be the maximally indeterminate beginning.
Exactly. Option 2. You fully embrace the premise. You say, okay, object of representation is truly, absolutely contentless, maximally indeterminate. But then you hit the loose wheel dilemma.
The loose?
Yeah, it's like a gear in a machine that isn't connected to anything. If the highest concept is genuinely empty, it seems to add absolutely nothing philosophically useful to the original opposition between something and nothing that Kant wanted to mediate. It just becomes an empty label saying, okay, folks, we're now discussing stuff that's either possible or impossible. It doesn't do the mediating work Kant set out for it.
It seems like Kant correctly saw that a system needs a single, unified starting point, a mediating concept. But the very logic he used to define concepts seems to undermine that starting concept's ability to actually function, threatening to make it either not the highest point or completely empty and useless.
That's the bind. He creates this static, necessary placeholder, but it's constantly teetering on the edge of collapsing into pure emptiness or revealing itself to be not quite as fundamental as claimed.
Okay, so this unresolved tension, this sort of theoretical knot at the very beginning of Kant's system, this sounds like exactly the kind of thing Hegel would seize upon.
Oh, absolutely. Hegel sees this difficulty in Kant's foundation as symptomatic of a deeper issue. For Hegel, Kant, despite his incredible insights, still ultimately treated logic as something separate, a kind of fixed, formal toolbox for thinking distinct from the actual content of reality itself.
And Hegel's grand project, the Wissenschaft der Logik, the science of logic, is essentially his answer to this whole problem, his way of providing a truly grounded beginning.
Yes, the WDL, as it's often called, functions as Hegel's transcendental philosophy, but it's conceived very differently. He defines it as the science of pure thinking. That means thought considered just as thought, concerned only with the inherent structure and determinations of reason itself, what he calls thought determinations or Denkbestimmungen. These are like the pure concepts, the essential categories of thought.
Now, the really huge radical step Hegel takes here is saying that this logic, this science of pure thought, actually coincides with metaphysics, right?
Mm-hmm. That's the absolute game changer. This single move just demolishes the boundary that Kant worked so hard to establish, the boundary between how we think, logic, epistemology, and what reality is like in itself, metaphysics.
Explain that a bit more. How does logic become metaphysics for Hegel?
Well, for Kant, remember, the categories of our understanding, pure concepts like substance, causality, were fundamentally rules for organizing our experience, for structuring phenomena, the world as it appears to us. He explicitly denied they could tell us about things in themselves.
Right, the limit of critique.
But for Hegel, the structure of pure thought revealed in the logic isn't just about the human way of thinking. He argues that the necessary laws and categories of pure thought are, in fact, the fundamental structures of all being. The way thought must think reflect the way reality is constituted.
So when Hegel analyzes, say, the concept of being or substance in his logic, he's not just mapping human concepts. He believes he's uncovering the actual metaphysical structure of reality itself, independent of any particular human observer.
That's the claim. The logic aims to trace the self-development of thought from its simplest determination all the way to the absolute idea. And this process is simultaneously the unfolding of the fundamental structure of reality. It goes all the way, as you said earlier, to thinking beings as they are in themselves.
Okay, if the stakes are that high, if logic is metaphysics, then the question of the system's starting point becomes even more critical, even more demanding.
Exactly. The beginning can't just be relatively indeterminate, like Kant's object of representation, which was still vaguely tied to our representing. It has to be absolutely immediate, completely unconditioned, because it's supposed to be the starting point for everything. #tag 5, the immediate semantic beginning and absolute indeterminacy.
Okay, so if the logic is the science of everything, the self-thinking thought of the absolute, its starting point can't depend on anything else. It has to be immediate.
Perfectly put. Immediate in the sense that its meaning, its content, cannot be derived from or mediated by any other concept or content. If the starting concept relied on something else for its definition, the system would instantly fail its claim to providing an absolute, self-grounded foundation.
It has to just appear spontaneously to pure thought.
Yes. It must be a content that pure thinking finds simply there, without any prior logical steps or definitions leading to it. And this strict requirement of absolute immediacy forces Hegel to basically take Kant's indeterminacy problem and push it to its absolute extreme.
How does immediacy lead to extreme indeterminacy?
This is where Hegel deploys a principle derived from Spinoza, but gives it a dynamic Hegelian twist. Omnis determinatio est negatio. All determination is negation.
Meaning something gets its specific identity only by being marked off from what it is not.
Exactly. A thought content only becomes definite, determinate, through contrast with its other. To think A clearly means implicitly distinguishing it from not A. The very act of thinking A as A involves or is mediated by the negation of not A.
Okay, I follow that. Determination requires contrast, which involves negation.
So now think about the beginning. If the starting concept must be absolutely immediate, meaning utterly unmediated,
Then it must be completely free of negation, because negation implies mediation, the contrast with an other.
precisely. And if it's completely devoid of negation, according to the principle omnis determinatio is negatio,
It must be completely devoid of determination. It has to be absolutely indeterminate.
bingo. This relentless logical path leads Hegel straight to his choice for the one and only possible starting concept for absolute logic: pure being.
Pure being. Not the being of this chair or that thought or God or anything specific, just being itself.
Just the completely abstract, indeterminate thought of isness, you might say. Being in general stripped bare of every conceivable difference or determination. No quality, no quantity, no relation, no modality, no location, no time. Just the sheer empty affirmation that something is.
Wow. Okay, let's compare that directly to Kant then. Kant started with objective representation, aiming for something less determinate than possible, but still tied, maybe vaguely, to representation.
Right. Kant wanted relative indeterminacy to mediate a logical distinction. Hegel goes all the way. He starts with pure being precisely because it's absolutely indeterminate. He fully accepts the consequence that haunted Kant. The highest, most immediate concept must be utterly empty. And interestingly, just like Kant's highest concept was the object of thought in general, Hegel's pure being is also, in a sense, the object of pure thought in general, just taken to an even more radical level of abstraction.
So Hegel basically looks at the emptiness problem that troubled Kant's starting point and says, that's not a bug, that's the feature. That's exactly where we have to start.
That's a perfect way to put it. He embraces the void. Hashtag Text 6, the dialectic of being and nothing.
Okay, but now we hit the loose wheel problem again, don't we? If pure being is absolutely indeterminate, completely empty, how does it avoid just being a useless static placeholder like Kant's concept threatened to be? How does it possibly generate the immense complexity of Hegel's entire system?
This is where Hegel's genius lies, in showing that this absolute indeterminacy isn't static at all. It's inherently unstable, inherently dynamic. It must move. And it moves through what he calls dialectical necessity.
And the key move, the first step of this dialectic, is the shocking realization that pure being isn't just indeterminate, it's actually nothing.
Exactly. Think about it. If you try to really grasp the thought of pure being completely in general stripped of all specific content, no qualities, no boundaries, no relations, what is left in your thought? What have you actually grasped?
Emptiness.
Absence.
Precisely. Hegel famously states it. Being, the indeterminate immediate, is in fact nothing, and neither more nor less than nothing. The attempt to think pure, undifferentiated being collapses immediately into the thought of pure, undifferentiated nothingness. Okay, so pure being collapses into pure nothing. What exactly is pure nothing for Hegel here? Is it just Kant's logical contradiction?
No, it's different. It's not defined by contradiction initially. It's defined by absence. Pure nothing is the thought of complete emptiness, simple self-equality, the total absence of any determination or content whatsoever. It's the void.
But wait, if pure being is defined as absolute indeterminacy, and pure nothing is also defined as absolute indeterminacy,
then they are found to be the very same content. When you purely think the concept being at its most abstract, you find only indeterminacy. When you purely think the concept nothing at its most abstract, you find only indeterminacy. In terms of their actual thought content, which is just sheer emptiness, they are indistinguishable.
that feels like a bit of philosophical sleight of hand. Are they really the same?
Hegel argues it's not a trick, but a necessary result of pushing abstraction to its absolute limit. Thought itself discovers their identity in content. However, and this is the crucial dialectical turn, thought also knows they cannot be the same.
Why not? Because their meaning, their intention, is completely opposite. Being is affirmation, nothing is negation.
Precisely. Remember, omnis determinatio es negatio. Even to think the concept being meaningfully thought must implicitly contrast it with its fundamental opposite, nothing. Their definitions require them to be opposed. So thought is caught in an immediate contradiction. One, their content, absolute indeterminacy, is identical. 2, their meaning, affirmation versus negation, is absolutely opposed.
They are the same, and yet they absolutely are not the same all at once.
Exactly. And this contradiction, this tension where being instantly vanishes into nothing and nothing instantly vanishes back into being because you can't think one without implying the other. This is not a state that thought can rest in. It's inherently unstable.
So thought is forced to move to resolve this contradiction somehow.
Yes. The resolution isn't picking one or the other, but recognizing their inseparable unity and their difference. This immediate vanishing of each into the other is the first concrete dynamic concept of the logic. Hegel calls it becoming, Werden.
Becoming.
Becoming is the concept of this unstable oscillation, this dynamic process where being passes into nothing and nothing passes into being. It's the synthesis that holds both moments together. And from becoming, Hegel then immediately derives the next concept, determinate being, the sign being that has some quality, being here. And the whole magnificent engine of the logic kicks into gear, generating category after category.
Wow. So Hegel turns Kant's static problem, the potentially empty highest concept, into the very source of dynamism. The contradiction isn't a flaw to be avoided, it's the engine.
That's exactly his critique of Kant, essentially. He thinks Kant correctly identified the need to start with an indeterminate concept, but then got scared by the inherent contradiction he glimpsed. Kant didn't realize that this very contradiction, this identity and difference of the most fundamental concepts, being and nothing, was precisely the generative power needed to necessarily unfold the entire system of thought reality without arbitrary additions.
The system becomes self-generating from that initial spark of contradiction.
That's the claim. Because the start is absolutely indeterminate, no assumptions are smuggled in. All subsequent concepts emerge purely from the internal logical necessity of resolving the contradictions inherent in the previous stage. And just to underscore the point about our identity, Hegel even remarks that the logic could just as well have started with pure nothing.
Really? How would that work?
If you start by thinking pure nothing, absolute indeterminacy, you immediately realize that thinking this void is itself a kind of being, the being of that thought, or that the concept requires contrast with pure being. So pure nothing would instantly transition into pure being, generating the exact same initial contradiction, being I is nothing, being I is not nothing, leading to the same result. Werden, becoming. The starting point is indifferent because the initial concepts are, in their indeterminacy, identical. #tag7. Final philosophical comparison.
Okay, let's try to pull this together. We've journeyed from the traditional starting point through Kant's critique and finally to Hegel's radical beginning. It seems we have three really distinct ways of thinking about the role of nothing at the foundation of philosophy.
We do. First, there's the traditional approach, maybe best represented by Baumgarten. Here, the system starts with a clear, determinate, logical nothing, the nihil negativum. Nothingness is simply defined as logical contradiction, a violation of formal consistency. It's a clear no.
Then comes Kant. He says, not so fast. He rejects that purely logical start as not fundamental enough. He elevates the beginning to the less determinate mediating concept of objective representation in general.
Right. And from that starting point, using the structure of our human cognitive faculties, categories, space, time, Kant systematically derives his table of nothings. It's a sophisticated map of how concepts can fail to meet the conditions of our possible experience. We got the ens rationis, nihil privativum, ens imaginarium, and finally the nihil negativum.
So Kant's nothings are fundamentally about the limits of human knowledge. They define the boundaries.
Exactly. Kantian nothingness is largely an assessment of failure relative to us, relative to the conditions of finite human cognition. It marks the fence around our experiential pasture.
Okay. And then third, we have Hegel. He blows past Kant's limitations, asserting logic as metaphysics. He starts with the most extreme point imaginable, the absolutely indeterminate pure being.
Which, as we saw, immediately reveals itself to be identical in its indeterminacy to pure nothing. And crucially, Hegel doesn't see this as a failure or a limit. He uses the inherent immediate contradiction between these identical yet opposed concepts as the generative spark.
The contradiction creates Werden, becoming, which then drives the entire system forward, unfolding all other concepts.
Right. So the fundamental philosophical difference really boils down to the role and nature of negation, of nothingness itself. For Kant, negation primarily defines the outside the limits, the boundaries of possible knowledge for us. It's largely a constraint.
But for Hegel,
negation, nothingness, is radically internal. It's a constitutive moment of thinking itself. Thought, for Hegel, is inherently dialectical, meaning it moves through negation. To grasp any determinate concept, like blue, You necessarily have to think it's negation, not blue, and synthesize them. Negation isn't just a limit, it's part of the engine that creates determination.
So in a way, Hegel's table of nothings isn't a separate table like Kant's. It's the entire science of logic.
That's a fantastic way to think about it. The entire logic is a process of determining concepts by constantly working through negation, by defining what something is through understanding what it is not, and how those oppositions resolve into higher truths. The logic is a continuous process of defining non-being as it generates being, moving towards a complete self-understanding of the absolute idea.
So Kant gives us a taxonomy of the ways concepts can fail to become objects for us. Hegel tries to give us the story of how concepts are generated out of the primordial failure, the absolute nothingness being at the start.
Precisely. One defines the limits of a finite system. The other attempts to show the necessary self-generation of an absolute system from its most indeterminate, seemingly empty starting point. It's a profound difference in philosophical ambition and method. #Heg outro.
Well, we've certainly covered a lot of ground there, tracing this fundamental question, where does philosophy begin? Through its deep connection with the concept of nothingness.
It's really quite a journey, isn't it? Seeing how these incredibly sharp minds realize that the question of the starting point is completely tied up with how you understand the most basic concepts, including absence and indeterminacy itself.
You saw Kant grappling with the need for a stable, highest, mediating concept, the object of representation, but running into that persistent problem. How can it have enough content to be useful without losing its status as the absolute foundation?
That static tension. And then Hegel, who just dives headfirst into absolute indeterminacy, taking pure being pure nothing and finding the engine of the entire system precisely in their contradiction, aiming for a self-generating necessity.
Which leaves us, and you listening, with a really deep question to chew on. Kant was worried, it seems, that starting with pure indeterminacy would leave the system foundationless, without real content. Hegel argued the opposite. Only by starting with that absolute contradictory indeterminacy could the system guarantee the necessity and completeness of everything that follows.
So the final thought for you is this. Which approach seems to offer a more secure foundation for a truly comprehensive system of knowledge? Is it the Kantian model, carefully mapping the boundaries set by our finite cognition? Or is it the Hegelian gamble, attempting to derive everything dynamically from absolute emptiness, from the dialectic of being and nothing itself?
What does this profound philosophical wrestling match over nothing ultimately tell us about the very nature of our first, most fundamental thoughts?
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the beginning of philosophy and the surprising role of nothingness within it.
We'll catch you next time.